Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Theocafe is about to begin. Chicka-chicka. All right, well, let's forget about grog because their volume's not going on there. So, welcome everybody to Theocafe. Nice and light and breezy. So we did have Grug up there to explain the group norms to you all, but Grug was silent, so I'll explain them to you. So they're very simple, just general kind of adult communication, mature people being able to disagree stuff, right? Stuff you learn in primary school and ignore, and then you learn again in middle school and you ignore, and then you learn again in high school. Maybe you might, keep it. Most of the time, you just ignore it. So hopefully, though, by the time we're adults, we can do this kind of stuff. So number one is play the player, not the ball. We understand what that means, right? That if we disagree with someone, we don't have a go at the person. Play the ball, not the player. So ball, not player, right? Ball, not player. Okay, so you don't have a go at the person. You don't make assumptions about them. You don't sort of label them. You attack, criticize, whatever, the idea, right? Not the person. So basic, so incredibly simple, right? Number two, disagreement is not disrespect. Right? Defensiveness is normal for all of us. It's one of our kind of base human habits that we've grown throughout sort of evolutionary biology and things as we've gone along. All of us want to defend ourselves. We want to feel like we're more right than others. But just because somebody doesn't agree with us does not mean they're being offensive in any way, right? Especially if we're part of a faith community. So, for example, I'll take an example of this recent vote we had. If we're going to vote no, and we walk and we see somebody from our parish or a friend or something who's holding yes signs and said, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" We don't just go, "Oh, hi. I'm voting no, you're voting yes, we're different." Right? We treat them and greet them like friends, because we are. And we respect each other, and we listen to each other. Very simple. Disagreement is not disrespect. We're not 5-year-olds. We need to be able to be respectful of each other, but also we can be passionate. We can be clear and concise about what we believe. We can openly disagree, right? As well as being respectful to each other, right? So you understand the group norms. They're very simple. Let's just try and be adults and realize that we can disagree at times and learn from each other. Wouldn't that be incredible? Wouldn't that be great? That'd be incredible. All right, because we're doing a topic about war, of course, such a light, fluffy topic, I thought I should probably start with a song. So, sorry? Nope, definitely not.
Jimmy joined the army 'cause he had no place to go. There ain't nobody hiring around here since all the jobs went down to Mexico. He reckoned that he'll learn himself a trade, maybe see the world. Move to the city someday and marry a black-haired girl. Somebody somewhere had another plan. Now he's got a rifle in his hand, rolling into Baghdad, wondering how it got this far. He's just another poor boy off to fight a rich man's war. Bobby had an eagle and a flag tattooed on his arm. Red, white, and blue to the bone when he landed in Kandahar. Left behind a pretty young wife and a baby girl. A stack of overdue bills, and he went off to save the world. It's been a year now and he's still there, chasing ghosts in the thin, dry air. Meanwhile, back at home, the finance company took his car. He's just another poor boy off to fight a rich man's war. When will we ever learn? When will we ever see? Stand up and take our turn. Keep telling ourselves we're free. Ollie was a second son of a second son. Grew up in Gaza, throwing bottles and rocks when the tanks would come. There ain't nothing else to do around here, just a game children play. Something about living in fear all your life makes your heart that way. He answered when he got the call, wrapped himself in death and he praised Allah. A fat man in a new Mercedes drove him to the door. He's just another poor boy off to fight a rich man's war.
So this is not about whether we support troops or not, right? It's not. People go to war for many different reasons. People join up to be part of a nation's military for a million different reasons, and they deserve respect. You know why? Because the people who start wars don't go. People who are incredibly wealthy most of the time, not all the time, don't go. This is not about whether we support troops. It's not about whether we're real Australians or this, that, or the other. This is about ideas of war, right? Theories of war, causes of war. So we can engage with each other, and you can take it wherever you like. I'm not going to control that. But we can engage with each other and try and learn a bit more about this horrible situation. I'm sure one big situation's on many of our minds at the moment. But all right, so I'm going to grab this microphone because I walk around all the place when I speak. As you can imagine, I found this really hard to keep to 15 minutes. I hope I have. I've cut out so much stuff. So I'm sure that many of you can fill in what I've cut out, all right? But, all right, let's begin. Next slide, if we can, please. Theocafe, war, lovely. Okay, so what is war? Well, defined in the Oxford Dictionary, a state of armed conflict. I can look there. A state of armed conflict between different countries or different groups within a country. A state of competition or hostility between different people or groups. A sustained campaign against an undesirable situation or activity. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good general explanation of what war is. Excellent. We can go to the next one. Top 8 causes of war, statistically. Economic. So examples of an economic war are the Gay and Anglo-Indian Wars of 1766 to 1849. The Anglo-Indian Wars were a series of wars fought between the British and East India Company and different Indian states. These wars led to the establishment of British colonial rule in India, which gave Britain unrestricted access to exotic and valuable resources native to the Indian continent. Right? Another example of an economic war is the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1860. 2 wars were fought between the Qing dynasty, I always pronounce that incorrectly, and Western powers in the 19th century. Britain wanted to access trade with China, whereas China wished to remain independent and essentially isolated. China always wanted to be isolated, right? In that way. I'm not putting a judgment on that, it's just the way it was. Japanese invasion in 1931 to 1932, critically short of raw materials to supply its industrial growth, Japan launched an invasion of the Chinese province. Following a successful conquest, the Japanese established a puppet state of, yeah. Great, so they're 2 examples of an economic war. We're going to kill people because we want money, right? All right, next one. Territorial gain. Roman conquest of Britain. I don't need to explain that to many of you. I think most of us kind of learned that in school, all those kind of things, but it's there if you would like to read about it. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. It was fought following the annexation of Texas, with Mexico claiming the land as their own, which it kind of was at the time. The US eventually won, and Texas went on to be incorporated as a state, and now they're talking even this year of seceding from the USA and becoming their own country anyway, so big mess. But they've been a great part of the US since. Serbo-Bulgarian War. This was a border dispute that broke out between Bulgaria and Serbia over the victory of Eastern Rumelia. Religion apparently is another cause of war. I know. This one I actually think is probably one of the most debatable, and as we read this, you kind of see why. The Crusades, well, yes, however, Rome really wanted some land there. They would have loved that land and the riches that came with it. And to use God to get that land is extremely useful. However, series of religious wars, most of them were actually a failure. There was a couple of successes, but most of it was a failure. And of course, it was mostly the peasants that went. During the medieval age, the aim of the Crusaders was to overthrow Islamic rule and achieve Christian dominance of the region. Why do they want dominance? Because they like the land. Right? It obviously does hold religious significance to us. But to claim that was the main reason is interesting. Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1829, fought by the Greek revolutionaries against the Ottoman Empire. This war had a large religious element. This was particularly evident early on, with many Christian Greeks seeing the conflict against the Muslim Turks as a holy war. Which is interesting because the Ottoman Empire respected and allowed Christianity to exist within its borders. So if that's the case, why? Lebanese Civil War, 1975 to 1990. Lebanese Civil War developed out of a socio-economic and political tension. Well, then why is it there? Which manifest as a power conflict between Sunni Islam and Shiite Muslim and Christian Lebanese populations. But it was a socio-economic and political tension. But then we use these other little bits to justify it. All right, next one. Nationalism. Don't we love it? It's a wonderful thing. I'm kidding. Anybody at home, I don't believe that. Yugoslav Wars, 1991-2001. During the breakup of Yugoslavia, various nationalist groups such as Serbs, Croatians, Bosnians fought each other, often fueled by historic ethnic and cultural tensions. Right? We find a lot of wars are cultural and ethnic. And those cultures and ethnicities often have faiths within them, and they're very easy to blame. World War. Don't need to say anything about that. I think, and I'm happy to be challenged on any of this, but I kind of agree that World War I was quite fueled by nationalism in many different ways. The Italo-Ethiopian War of 1935-36, maybe not as well known, but Mussolini, not the greatest guy in the world, rose to power in Italy on the promise that he would restore national pride in Italy, right? Wonderful, excellent. We've got to be a little bit selfish and look after our own first. But he just took that to an extreme. Seeking to salvage Italian prestige after previous defeat in Ethiopia, Mussolini's troops gained full dominion of the Horn of Africa in 1936. Right? So it was a nationalistic uprising. Revenge. The Boudiccan Revolt, following a failure by the Romans to honour an agreement made with her husband and the brutal rape of her daughter, the warrior queen of ancient British Celtic Iceni tribe launched an all-out war against the Roman occupiers. Following some initial success by the Britons, the revolt was eventually put down. World War II, I think it's far more complicated, World War II. But there absolutely was an element of revenge in that. That revenge led to nationalism, which was absolutely highly promoted by Hitler. And then Hitler, guess what he used? Religion, right? Against others. Even though it didn't matter if you were an observant Jew. It didn't matter at all. If you were a cultural Jew, if you were born into a Jewish family, they didn't care if you observed or not. They didn't care if you believed or not. That was the issue. So that could be in a couple of different areas, World War II, of course. All right, and I think the last one, is it? Oh, sorry, the war in Afghanistan, of course, was a revenge war as well. This war could be seen as being partially motivated by revenge, probably quite heavily, with the US striking back at Al-Qaeda for the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001. The terrorist group were being given safe haven by the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which prompted American-led NATO invasion. Right? If the towers were not hit on 9/11, would they have invaded? We don't know? Well, considering they didn't actually find any weapons of mass destruction, there wasn't. So I think revenge was a big... I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that revenge was a major reason for that. And I can't blame Yeah, I'm not making judgment on that. All right, the next one. Civil War, American Civil War, we know about that. Russian Civil War, most of us will know about that as well, 1917 to 23. Russian Civil War occurred in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, with the Red Army and the White Army vying to determine Russia's political future. Spanish Civil War, 36 to 39, fought between the Republicans, who were loyal to the left-leaning Second Spanish Republic, and the Nationalists, a conservative group led by the General Francisco Franco. Right? These are examples of civil wars. None of this is judgment, it's just compartmentalising them. All right, next one. Revolutionary War, American Revolution, we know about that. French Revolution, we know about that if we don't stop me, and I'm happy to explain things. The Haitian Revolution, I think most of us would know about that as well. Haitian Revolution was a successful slave rebellion that established Haiti as the first free black republic. Isn't that great? Yeah. Which, if we justify wars by God, we would have to say was God's will. Depends on how you see war. All right, next one. Defensive war. The Gaelic Wars. These are really old, these ones. Really interesting stuff to look into, though, right? And the Iraqi conflict. An international coalition led by the US invaded Iraq on the grounds of that country's leader, Saddam Hussein, was developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, they're not saying that he didn't do anything else bad. They're just saying that was the clear mandate for invading. And it was. Any of us who live... I'm old enough now to have lived through that. And that was the reason and the justification of them invading. Right? We're getting there. And therefore presented a threat to surrounding countries and the rest of the world. The war was controversial as the allegations made about the weapons of mass destruction by the US and the UK were shown to lack any substance. They just didn't have any.
There wasn't any when they made a decision.
Yeah, no, we'll get there. We'll get to what repercussions do we have if we just lie about things. All right, next one. Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is very, very, very modern and understood by most of us, right? Russian troops invaded the Ukraine, a major escalation of a conflict that had been begun in 2014. Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, no, I'll just keep going, argued that the military action was defensive in nature. Absolutely. With the aim of being to demilitarize the Ukraine. That's right. Absolutely. It's like Gaza being an actual threat. Stop the further expansion of NATO and prevent the attack on Russia. These claims have been widely disputed. Lovely. I'm not going to. Again, I have never served. I'm aware that I've only spoken to people who are part of my family who have served. Everything I know is from books and all that sort of stuff. I've never held a rifle at night time worrying about my life. And I'm happy to be pushed back on any of this. Sorry? Well, that's good. Yeah, no, rabbits are delicious. All right. So now we're going into some theories of war. I'm trying to get through this as quick as I can. And I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of stuff that will be missed out. Just war theory. Have you heard of it? Great. So Augustine was a big proponent of this, but it goes well before Augustine. You know, the Egyptians spoke about it, the Romans spoke about it in some sort of way. But we have, that then is filtered through and has been thought about for obviously thousands of years, and we have a modern understanding of just war theory, right? So, just war theory. Next slide, please. Thank you, sir. Jus ad bellum. Who's great with Latin? What does it mean? It's Latin. It's not jus as in a delicious sauce. Go to the next one, Josiah. Yeah. So, jus ad bellum is basically how do you justify before going to war, right? So, is it for a just cause? This is part of just war theory. These are the questions that you ask. Is it with the right intention? Is it from a legitimate authority? Does it have due proportionality? Is it the last resort? Imagine if we weren't subjective creatures, right? This will make these questions much easier, but we are. Next one. Jus in bello. So when you are in the conflict itself, what are the things that we consider? Discrimination. Actually, that's a positive discrimination. So what that means is, can you discriminate between the enemy, massive inverted commas there, and the ally, right? And the innocent and the not innocent, okay? Proportionality. Is the reaction in proportion to the threat? No intrinsically unethical means should be used within the conflict. We're talking about war, right? It's almost laughable, but this is the theory. And this is what people will often try their best to stick to justify a war. Following orders is not a defense. We saw that through the Nazi trials. Many Nazis tried to claim, I was just following orders. And that's actually not a defense anymore in the Geneva Convention. Next one. And then just post bello, you can understand what that means, after you've killed all the people. It's war. That's the case. You go to war, you're going to be causing casualties. Why would we want to pretty that up? It's true. Status quo ante bellum, a Latin term meaning the way things were before the war. So before we go to war, before we try and cause force to each other, we need to think of all those other things. During the war, hang on, could you stop? Don't shoot your gun for a second. Is this justified? Have you used the same kind of force that I have? We've got to ask those questions of our combatants, right? And then after the war, can they go back to a similar way to the things were before we decided to go to war? I don't know. That's part of just war theory, right? Number 2, punishment for war crimes. There is good reason why international communities have come together and tried to outline, and people do these things with the absolute best intention, trying to minimize harm, right? What war crimes are. So people must be punished for war crimes. We've actually seen that quite recently with a high-ranking person in our Australian military who has been shown objectively to have committed war crimes. The amount of people that come out and still support that person is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Compensation of victims. Innocent people who've been caught up in the conflict under international law should be given due compensation for what they've lost. This is war. And peace treaties. Peace treaties should be used wherever possible. Right? Okay, so that's just war stuff. We're getting there. Trust me, I know this isn't enough for one, and on another side it's too much. I'm talking too much. It's very, very tough. Evolutionary biology theory. This is a very simple one. Next slide, please. Humans are animals. Animals fight for territory. Animals fight for food. Therefore, we have war. It seems laughable, but that's almost everything that war comes down to throughout the history. Of course, because we're more complex as animals, we have consciousness, all of those kind of things, then we can complicate things more. But really, at the core of it, a lot of the time it comes down to territory. And it comes down to not so much food, but wealth. When we go to war, we're at our most animalistic. Again, this is not against anybody who served and tried to do the best for their country. All right, next one. Game theory. This is interesting theory. Countries will act on what they think other countries will do. They do not know what other countries can do. They do not know for sure how to act. If another country mobilizes troops, the other country will do the same. War can be avoided through communication. You know, in a perfect world, maybe. But again, we're human creatures that are always going to suspect each other. But that's a major theory in I forgot I put that there. Yeah. that is one of the major theories, war theories, and it gets far more complicated, right? So, I tried to keep it a little light at the end, and I've gone too far. Again, in one way, I haven't said anywhere near enough. It's far more complicated. And the other way, I can't keep going because we'll be here all night. So, war, good God, y'all. What is it good for? So this is the question I wanted to pose to you as well. I think it's very difficult. What is murder?
Apparently it's killing someone,
No, it can't be. No.
except if you're authorised by your leader.
And I don't say this flippantly. I'm not trying to accuse people who have been, and people get conscripted, people are forced into it. People go into the military for absolutely good reasons. My brother did it. Yes, he is. He hurt his back, so now he works as a civilian in the military. But he was in Timor, he was actually in Fiji for a little while, got really hairy there for a bit. He went over to Afghan for a bit. He's a good man. So if we wanted to get really complex, we would ask this question. Do I have one last slide or a couple of last ones? Fantastic. Let's have a palate cleanser. And that's Harry Styles. He has to come into every single Theocafe that we have. Lovely. Nice little palate cleanser for us all. So, absolutely. So, my question is, well, I guess the questions are quite simple here. And I didn't even touch on how faith sees war, right? Because again, we would be here for another hour. But it is important to realize that the earliest Jesus followers, and all the evidence points to, were pacifists. Because they said, how do we worship a God that was executed by the state legally and then support the killing of other people? But then there's been many different theories that have been brought up throughout the ages. And to look at the different faiths and where they stand on war is incredibly complex, because just like Christianity, there are so many different understandings and views and rationalities for everything within many different faiths. All right, so if we can, when we're asking questions or making a statement, if we can use this, that'd be great, because then people at home can hear us. If not, I'll just repeat the question or the statement. Yes. Vicky.
I'm not a professor of history. Can you hear me over there? I'm not a professor of history, but I'm a very interested person in history, and I've done a lot of reading and so on. I understand that one of the problems in the country that is called Israel, which I call Palestine, was in 1947, after the Holocaust, the free country, the Allied countries and the Western world decided what has happened during the Holocaust is shocking. It's terrible. There was anti-Semitism right throughout Europe from way beyond before Jesus. But in 1947, Britain, I believe, was the instigator of sending a boatload of Jews that had survived to Palestine, because that was the country called Judea, called Israel. That's where the Jews sort of feel happy at home. What's happened is that Jewish people from around the world have become militarised, partly, I suppose, in revenge for the Holocaust. And you've got lots of Americans and other people who've gone there, joined the forces in Israel, and the government of Israel has decided to keep their bit of land that they stole from the Palestinian Arabs and build houses and settlements and whatnot. And this is a complex issue. But what worries me is the effect of all this, and the Ukraine and World War II and so on, the effect of all this on ordinary people and families.
Yes.
My father spent 6 years in the British Army learning how to kill the enemy. When he came home, he was damaged. So he took it out on me. I'm an only child. And he would belt me for whatever, anything really. And it took a long time before he stopped. And I know friends of my age whose fathers were seriously damaged as a result of learning how to kill. And there is no goodness in it, none at all.
Thank you, Vicky. Thanks for sharing that. So a couple of things you picked up on that I think are really important is focusing on the innocent people who are actually caught up in war. And that actually demands that we are a bit more thoughtful in how we engage in those kind of understandings. And certainly I think with what you picked up, Reese, about the current conflict with Israel-Palestine, is that Judaism and Zionism are two different things. It's really important that we're able to identify that, right? What Hamas has done is horrific. It's not justified. We cannot support it. The horrible atrocities that the IDF have committed towards the Palestinians is horrible, disgusting, unjustified, and we cannot support it, right? I think it's really important that we name that. Just after 1947, 1948, what you were talking about, we had the thing that the Palestinians call the Nakba, where 42,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes and murdered. The rest were allowed to return to their homes as refugees. So not actually to their homes, but to refugee camps in the same towns that their houses were in. So it is a horrible geopolitical conflict. And if we start making this about Jew against Muslim or Christian against Jew or whatever, then we're doing an injustice to the whole thing. Because there are innocent people caught up in it on both sides. Yes, Paula.
Where does the Vietnam War fit in the theory?
No idea. Depends on what theory you take up.
They say it's the war that should never have happened. But
Do
it
they?
happened.
Thanks, Paula. Good question. My Uncle Joe was in Vietnam. He finds it extremely hard to talk about. So what did you say? Yeah, of course.
I had to put my marble in the barrel for Vietnam, so
Sure.
I went to my local Member of Parliament, Federal Member of Parliament. I asked him, why are we fighting a war in Vietnam, which has got nothing to do with Australia? And he rolled out the domino theory, the red's under the bed, yellow peril, and that similar rubbish. But I don't think the Americans wanted us fighting there. They didn't want us for conscription, but it was more economic. The French were losing their economic benefits. But I did want to mention World War III that we narrowly avoided when I was around about 15, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there was certainly some hawks in the American or the US government that really wanted to start fighting and get stuck into it. And I think the fingers might have been close to the buttons. And fortunately, in my opinion, John F. Kennedy had been to war. He knew what war was about, and he and his brother decided that they wouldn't start World War III, and they had a standoff with Khrushchev, who eventually withdrew the missiles. But I think we narrowly avoided World War III.
Great, thanks for that. There's a couple of really difficult questions in this. And of course, when I was an idealistic mid-teenager, I was a complete pacifist. And I think the core of me probably still is a little bit. So I want to raise my bias there, right? I'll come right to you, Liz. But there is a thing, if we do not lift a finger to defend, support and uphold those certainly since I've become a father, who are dearest to us, is that refusal to defend actually an act of violence? It's tough. And then how do we justify that, you know? Liz?
Seems to me that all wars are about either power or property. And we had that on the screen a few minutes ago. Power or property. Power over other people or property other people have. And it's worth considering that. Now, if you think of that about the Lord Jesus, he dealt with power by taking off his robe and washing people's feet. He dealt with property by saying, in his statement, foxes have holes and birds have ears of nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So here are some attitudes shown by Jesus. So the question I'm going to ask is a little bit spin off that, is has any good come out of that? Rather, let me put another. Does God use war to develop his world? Does God use war to develop his world?
Thanks for the question,
I'll
Les.
give my answer later.
Thanks for the question, Les. Whew. That's a question and a half, that one. That's a good one. Does God use war to develop God's world? Does God use war to develop God's world? The world, however you want to put that.
Do I need to stand? I can sit.
Oh, you can sit, that's
Is it
fine.
working?
As long as, yep, microphone's going well.
I was just thinking about something that the lady in blue had said, and there's something that's been fairly newly recognised called moral injury. I don't know if anyone's really heard of it. Has anyone heard of it?
Thanks for bringing that up, that's great.
So that can be something that can affect people like PTSD or a vicarious type of PTSD, which is a real thing, a real condition. So moral injury can be something that someone has witnessed, heard, felt, been present to, that conflicts with their values and beliefs. And it's not a kumbaya condition, it's a real thing. So that's something that I think if people can recognise within themselves and others that it is actually something that exists, then they can, learn to address trauma and things like that within themselves and towards other people, and maybe treat people a little bit more fairly. So that was my little bit for now.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Anita. No, thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely. And things like PTSD, correct me if I'm wrong, but things like PTSD too can be kind of generational. They can be passed down because someone with PTSD will then take that out on their son and daughter, and vicarious. Excellent. Good wording. Maureen, yes.
There's also, is that on?
Yes, it's on.
There's also the war that isn't a war. And the one that's affected me most, that I've seen so much of, is the problem in Ireland. A tiny little country, smaller than Tasmania. Northern Ireland is 90 miles by 70. And it's the whole of Ireland is 300 miles long. It's only a little island, and the people there in 1690, I think, fought the Battle of the Boyne, and the hatred has gone on since. The first time I saw the country that I really felt I knew much about it was when I was 19, and I saw the hatred then, but I thought that it would die with internet and telephones being a lot more available and all of that sort of thing. And it hasn't. I thought the new generation that had grown up travelling the world and seeing the world would realise what they had at home, and it hasn't.
And the hatred is still there today, the same as it always was. And that's a denominational war. It's only Roman Catholics against Protestants. There's no point for it. It wasn't even being fought over Ireland when William won it, and it only lasted for 4 flipping hours. It wasn't all that long. But look at what it's created.
Thanks, Maureen. And you know what that is? It's because their denomination, their religion, has become more about their identity and their culture than what it is about believing in Jesus. But their identity is either Catholic or Protestant. And they're defending their ego and themselves. Because that's who they are. That's who their family was. It means something to them. I'm not justifying this at all. What I'm trying to show is there is a difference between actual faith, belief, religion of Christ, and all of the other things that we shroud that in.
But look around at all the Irish people who moved out here, and they lose it. But
Sure.
over there, it goes on and on and on and on. 1690, going on since.
Anybody want to shoot me down in flames? Graham, did you want to say? Excellent.
Just a couple of things, if I could remember them. I agree with what Lee said about power and property being part of the causes. Allied with that, I think, is greed as part of the property situation. But the question I'd like to ask is this. We face a problem in the world over centuries with population explosion, and it's getting larger and larger and larger. I have wondered for some time whether war is one of the ways in which population is controlled, along with volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, whatever you like.
Yep.
But it's one way in which population comes down.
Great. Thanks, Graham. That's really good. I'll just quickly touch on that, unless you want to first. Go for it first, Leslie.
He's asking the question, does God allow war?
Yeah, thanks, Les. So, actually, this is something I can excitedly speak on a little bit with some kind of knowledge, which is good. So, that was one of the theories, actually, that I left out of my presentation because it was becoming too long. The idea that war seems to rise when population is rising heavily, right? And I completely understand and think it's right that would make some sense. The incredible thing, and we have all the statistics and things to show this, which is great, about population growth is that the bell curve has plateaued. And the projection is, the next 10 years, it's going to start going down. Population, the kind of idea that population growth was going to explode to a point where we could no longer sustain anything has statistically and objectively been shown to not be the case anymore. It's understandable, absolutely, that we saw that and thought that was going to happen. But you know what the incredible thing is? It's because education and absolute poverty rates have lifted. People are having less children, far less children than they used to, not just in the West, but in developing countries now as well. And that population bell curve is evening out and will go down, which is good, unless we all just have one child and we go too low. And then we're all in trouble again. Yeah.
When the population goes down,
Yes.
you have this overload of an older generation.
Yes. Now,
What happens in China?
as to whether that actually answers, I think the question's still a good one, right? It doesn't, I don't think it has to be that we're getting to a point of the world cannot sustain how many people are there, therefore wars break out and things. I wonder if there is some kind of number. But if we look back on history, the Roman Empire was far less vast in number around the world than what we are. And there were actually more wars more consistently than what there are now. But I still think it's a really good question.
I wonder whether I could just touch on the greater good theory.
Yep.
There was in World War II, the British had broken the German codes, and the code breaker came to Churchill and told them that they were going to carpet bomb Coventry, and Churchill had then to make the decision to evacuate Coventry, and the Nazi spies would probably realise they'd been broken, and then that would be a real problem for the British. Or he let it happen, and basically for the greater good, because they could keep knowing what the Germans were going to do. He had a bad night and let it happen, and lots of people were killed in Coventry. Then they got into Dresden and sorted that out in Germany. Or the other one, for the greater good. Geez, I've lost it. Sorry.
That's right.
Oh yeah. That was in. No, I've lost it. It was in Gaza, wasn't it? No, sorry.
Depends. No, it's fine.
But it's if I think about it.
I think that this is where the stuff becomes really, really, really difficult. I mean, imagine being in that position.
Sorry, like Hiroshima. And
Hiroshima.
Nagasaki.
Yeah.
Basically,
Yeah.
millions thousands of Americans would die if they got caught in the mainland, and they decided to use the bomb. So it's probably crazy.
If those bombs hadn't been dropped.
That brings out Shoemaker's statement.
Mm.
There are many evils worse than war, and war brings out more.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Imagine being in the position of Winston Churchill. Imagine that. Imagine being in that position. How do we judge someone who is in that position? We can certainly judge the decision that person made, but if he had evacuated that area and the Germans realised that he had broken the code, how many more millions of lives may have been killed? But then he has to make a decision where he's actually essentially sacrificing and allowing thousands of people to die. This is the horror of war. Nobody should have to make that decision. It's horrendous. And it shows incredible character that a person had to. But those decisions should never have to be made in the first place. And I think your question, Nada, was a really good one. You know, who's greater good? That's right. Because we forget that there are innocent people always who are caught up in this stuff. People who just want to raise their kids, just want to feed their families, just want to be able to find prosperity. And every single civilian life that is lost, that is innocent, is a horrendous tragedy. I mean, we can be completely simplistic and just jump on sides, but and we can't pretend that some things are not more just than others either. Yes.
One of the things I think that you didn't mention about just about every war is the fundamentalists. Fundamentalists who, like the Shiite and the Sunni, and the Christians and the Islamists and all that sort of thing, this is what I strongly believe, and I'm going to kill the rest of you because you don't agree with me. And the other point I'd like to make is about hatred. I know that a lot of Australian servicemen were in Japanese camps during the Second World War, and some of them have never made peace with Japan. For years they wouldn't buy a Japanese car or trade with Japan, but there have been some wonderful films and wonderful stories about people who have united with the servicemen, the British servicemen who went to Dresden, who made their peace with the people in Dresden, the people on the Burmese railway and so on. I mean, the damage that these things do are just unbelievable.
I mean, and we won't continue on this track, but if you were to have a dog at home, right, and you decided to kick that dog, and then a few weeks later you decided to kick the dog again, and then you decided to kick the dog, and the dog bit you on the ankle, would you then lock that dog in a cage and shoot it, saying that it deserved it? That's more to do with the current situation. If we were flanked on one side, let's just say by a country called Bangalang, and they're a foreign country, we don't know them, and we were flanked on the other side by a country called Hoobastank, and they had control of our borders, right? We live in a place called Brisbane. These two foreign countries had control of our borders. When we are born in Brisbane, we are not allowed to leave unless they say you're allowed to leave. If we, in our very small area of Brisbane that has very few hospitals, had a life-threatening disease, we're only allowed to leave if these two foreign countries on either side allow us to leave. And even if it's life-threatening, they only allow us to leave 65% of the time. We've seen our grandma die because she wasn't allowed through the checkpoint because they didn't let her go for medical treatment. We have two choices of a government that could run and rule us. One is extremely, extremely aggressive and militant and will attack without provocation. The other one is still aggressive and militant, offers us more aid, but is less so than the other. They're the two options, so we hire this one, right, as people. And then all of a sudden, the people that we've hired lash out because their grandparents lived in land that they're now living in as refugees. We don't support them, it was our only chance. But this massive international power that is shooting back into our fishbowl says to 1.1 million of us, you need to leave, please, or you're going to be in massive danger of being killed. So we say, okay, can we leave through the checkpoint? Well, no, of course you can't. There's a blockade. So we go to those other neighbours. Can we come through here? Well, no, of course we can't. We can't do that. There's a blockade and we'll upset those other people. So you can tell us as much as you like that we have to leave, but you won't let us out. Is that a just war? Would it be just if you were driven out of your homes and then allowed back into Deception Bay, but only to live in a concrete refugee camp while other people who have come in, who as foreigners, are living in your house? That's the reality. Now, this does not justify for a second any loss of innocent life, targeting of civilians from those who support you. That's not okay. It's horrendous. It's unjustified. But this is not an easy conflict.
I guess if you have a country like Israel that their military does use their military weapons on innocent civilians, then how do you take down an Israeli government without starting a war?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And at the moment, the Americans have a ship there. But, you know, they have to sort of be seen to support them, but be seen to be neutral as well. Or the domino effect happens and then we're up sheep creek.
Sure. Yeah. $6 billion a year doesn't help, doesn't hurt either. Well, it's been a nice light topic. Anybody else? Yes, Nada. Yes. Absolutely, yeah. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it well, but hopefully I could.
You said before that it was
Bit
commonly
closer.
thought
That's
that
perfect.
the,
Good.
that the disciples were pacifists.
Yes.
You said.
Well, the earliest Christian
earliest
communities
church.
were, yeah.
Yes, the earliest. Not not
Yeah.
Jesus' specific disciples, but the early church. Do you think that the fact that the Emperor Constantine credited God with winning his war and then became a Christian and then therefore paved the way for the church to become more open and not so badly threatened? Do you think that changed the course of the thinking in the Christian church?
100%. Absolutely. So we can see evidence, like very clear evidence, that the earliest Christians were pacifists, because one of the big reasons they started being expelled from the synagogues was because in 70 AD, when the Temple of Jerusalem was being destroyed, the Christians refused to fight back against that because they believed in pacifism. They didn't want to take a life. They didn't believe in that. Whereas those who did not believe in Jesus as Messiah, they fought back, understandably. But the new Jesus movement followers wouldn't, because they didn't want to take a life. And it's interesting that after that, that's when people of the way, the early Jesus followers, started getting cast out of synagogues far more often. Because why did you not fight for us? Why did you not stop this from happening? Well, we worship a God that was executed legally by the state. How on earth can we go and do that to other people if we think it's just or not? And yes, Constantine, so many things changed when Christianity became a state religion. Yeah. Some good in that it spread, many bad in that it became a powerful thing. I don't know. I think you had some really good old sort of Christian people who absolutely supported slavery. Yeah. That's a deep question. That's right. Were they culturally Christian, or did they actually deeply want to follow Jesus' teaching? And Paul's teaching that said there's no longer Jew, free, slave, free, male or female. We're all one in the body of Christ. So how do you do that and then keep slaves? I don't know. Okie dokie. So we haven't resolved anything, which is great. Didn't expect us to. But hopefully we have, a bit more of an understanding of the different theories behind war. The complexities within it and the dangers of us tying war to things that just are not the core of that conflict. It's so easy for us to do that. It's so easy for us to find identity markers and then use them as the cause of these things. It's easy for the media to show the huge minority of extremists in different religions and say, Islam this, Christianity that, Judaism this. But time and time and time again, they are the fringe. And if you're actually on the ground and you speak to these people who are involved in these communities, you see that the reality is so different. I was staying with a Christian Palestinian family in Bethlehem when I was over there. Great people. And they shared, which is quite common, this is not an unusual thing. The top of their house wasn't quite finished because what they do then is they build for the next generation as they go up. So it looks like you've got all these unfinished houses, but that's not the case. It's quite normal. Anyway, sort of a concrete-ish house, and they had this sort of strip of green which would have been about as big as the sanctuary here if it was squared and kind of to the wall over there. Funnily enough, grass isn't as common as it is in Australia, in a sort of desert country. Anyway, they had this nice strip, and in the back of that they had some fig trees, obviously olive trees. They hadn't been annexed and taken yet. So they had fig trees, some olive trees, and a couple of other citrus things. And they lived directly next door to a Muslim neighbour, and they shared that back garden. And they cooked together, and they were friends. Because the reality of everyday people, the vast majority of the time, is they want to respect each other, they want to live their lives and support each other. War is evil. I don't know how else to put that. I truly believe it is. The people who go to war, it does not mean they're evil. Sometimes there are horrendous decisions that need to be made unless we decide we are going to allow people to be treated extremely poorly or murdered or killed. So it's evil, yes, but it's also complex. And certainly people like myself who have never been can try and educate as much as we can, but we don't have skin in the game. So we just kind of want to promote, don't blame the innocent. Don't make war about this faith or that faith. And remember that those who start them in modern days do not go, and neither do their kids. You got one more thing to say, Brian, before we finish up?
I try to stay silent.
Don't stay silent, that's ridiculous.
I'm like Clay. I've never been to war. I've got stories in my family. I've seen the impact of war. And I describe myself as a pacifist and see no reason for wars ever to exist, except for defending yourself against injustice. But if I might make war into something that we all deal with every day, what about the relationships that have conflict in them, that cross our path all the time, where we disagree with people? Because ultimately wars will only stop if we do things to treat each other with respect and with dignity and learn how to disagree well and negotiate that. Now, that's not an easy thing, so I'm not naive in saying it. But I would rather that we put our efforts into restoring those that have been damaged by war and not criticising them, and doing everything we can to seek peace in the world, starting with where we are. So war's a big topic, and we've certainly only touched the surface, like tangentially. And yet, to me, as I wrestle with these things over years, is to think, well, how do I live at peace with everybody I know?
So what you're saying is we need Theocafe cell groups in every different suburb and country of the world, so we can all learn to disagree as adults. It's exactly what you said, Brian. Yep, that's how it went. Excellent. Unless anybody has anything else. This really could have been broken into a couple of Theocafes and then bringing the faith into it and how that affects it.
Sorry, probably the last thing I wanted to say was I served from 1994 to 2004. And I can only say from my side, because joining, at 16 or just under 16, I guess I can only say that from my point of view, many of us, I speak for many of us, but I can only really speak for myself, that I have that soldiers or sailors mentality, and I understand that mentality to a degree, and that we have to shut our emotions off to get certain jobs done, and we have certain rules, and one of them is you have to perform the order and then complain about it after. So I don't really know what it's like to be everyone else here that may not have served. I'm on the flip side, so that's it.
See, what you've actually just said complicates everything, because if the teaching is perform the order and complain about it afterwards, and in international law you can't say that I was just following orders. You're stuck. How do How do you do that? Bob?
There's a whole bunch of thoughts going on, but the one that I'm really left with is I wonder whether the decisions that we make today while we're not at war would be the same decisions we make tomorrow if we were at war.
Great. Yes.
It's just that I believe we as Australians live in a lucky country. We've never experienced real war. And the closest I can remember is in World War II, when a plane flew over Brisbane at night and the air raid sirens went off, and it was a case of going to the air raid shelters. It was clear there was nothing wrong with it. It was a neutral plane. But living with the way in which the city was set up even then, with lights on motor vehicles, they were down to pinpoints, they were covered. You had your windows all plastered up with its, like a tar on the tar paper. You couldn't see out. And one year you didn't go to school at the beginning of the year because the slip trenches had not been dug by the parents. And that happened. Sorry? Oh.
It's on. You just got to tilt it so it's like that.
Oh, okay. Okay, and yes, you couldn't go to school because the slit trenches weren't dug, and that had to be done by the parents and their friends. And that was nothing really to do with war. It was the prevention of it and the preparedness for it, which never came. And thankfully the hordes of American soldiers in the city at that time probably was a deterrent. So the war in Papua New Guinea was certainly the major stoppage of that invasion.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. I think we've had a couple of generations now that have never had to experience it on our own soil or been involved in a major international conflict like World War I and World War II. And we're incredibly privileged to have not had to be involved in something like that. Don't ask me these questions, Maureen. Does good come out of war? I don't think good comes out of the act of war. But I've heard many atheist academics say that that's not true. Yeah, I get you. So there's no atheists in foxholes, right? I get that. I don't know. Never been in a foxhole. Never been next to one. Okay, so you're answering the question. Does good come out of war?
Not talking about all wars, but go back to that war that should never have happened, the Vietnamese War. It did open the doors for the Vietnamese to come to Australia. And they were welcomed with open arms. My father had the best friendship with the Vietnamese, and he taught a lot of those Vietnamese in Brisbane how to drive.
So, 10, 20 families need to be slaughtered, that's fine, as long as some come to Australia. This is the complexity of war, right? So could there have been immigration of the Vietnamese to Australia had that bloodshed not happened? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. But what you're saying is a good thing that came out of that was the ability of people to freely be able to move. Now, whenever we make those statements, we have to be very clear that that then doesn't justify the bloodshed or that sort of stuff that came with the liberation of that people. See why it's always so complex? And as humans, we're always so quick to say, well, if you support this, you must be a supporter of this. Because it's easier and it's quicker. And we don't want to have to get into the difficult discussions because sometimes we can get embarrassed if we don't know so much or that kind of thing. But it's really important, I think, when we make these kind of statements, that we make also those clarifications. Sorry? Sure. Sure. Well, there you go. There you go. Sure. Fantastic. There you go. Wonderful.
The third part on the screen was after war reconstruction and compensation. I personally have settled 11 Vietnamese boat refugees who came in a boat from Vietnam down to Singapore and settled into a camp there. And then they came down to Sydney. I was director of the parish and we settled 11 of those Vietnamese people, and they're wonderful people. And I think it's important for us to see that we just do the best that we can when war finishes. Does God bring good out of war? Well, you answer, I answer. I think he does. He allows it, just as he allows sin. He allows it there, and he brings good out of evil. That's the way I see it anyway. Thank you.
I think what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just saying what I'm hearing you say, it's not that God creates war, or God saying that war is good, but God can bring good out of a situation which has been horrific for people. Is that fairly accurate? Okay. Yeah. Yes, Paula.
Okay, going back to, is there good brought out of war? Back in World War II, I don't know if you all remember, but there were children sent from England to countries where there was no war happening, where they could stay with families. And children came to Australia, and my mother's cousins came to Australia. However, their mother did not realise that they could have stopped the children from coming and said, no, they're not going. But these children came out, and they're all just about passing on. Some have passed on. They wrote a book about the children called Children Abroad, which they are in, David and Gerald. And they've always talked about their time in Australia and said it was the best time of their life living in Australia, even though they're away from their parents, but they were still surrounded by the love of their families.
Okay. I guess we will finish up. But I think it's also good, apart from maybe Anita and whoever else is here who's actually served and put their skin in the game, that we all realise that we're sitting very comfortably here in Australia, in a very safe country. We're speaking about this theoretically. We may have relatives or friends who are caught up in the situation, and that's very sad and very, very difficult for any situation, any war. But we are lucky enough to be able to discuss this stuff in safety and from a theoretical perspective. That's a huge privilege for each of us. But it's important that we realise that if we have that privilege, who on earth are we to start getting angry at each other for disagreeing or to support the bloodshed of either side? So, look, I just want to thank everybody for being so incredibly open and being willing to digest what we've spoken about. Thank you for your wisdom, the wonderful questions that you all asked. And I really hope that the current situation dies down quickly. We must be people of hope. I hope, but I don't believe that'll be the case. So thank you all, and we'll talk to you next Theocafe.